for more on this story, we can bring in Garret Martin, who's co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center at the American University. Thank you very much for your time with us on France 24. Let's start off with Steve Witkoff. I mean, he's been accused by US lawmakers even of taking Russia's side. Is there any reason to believe that he's going to change tack today to avoid this kind of scrutiny?
I think it's a good question. I think that's going to be a really important test because already the challenge is that he is viewed with great suspicion on the parts, and it is important, not only of European lawmakers, of Ukrainian lawmakers, but also inside the Republican Party itself. I think what is important, though, is that Witkoff, for the moment, seems, along, of course, with Jared Kushner, to have the full trust of Donald Trump. And that is still an important commodity in negotiations. The Kremlin will know that Witkoff and Kushner should fundamentally speak with the word and the backing of Donald Trump. Now, it still seems that he has shown a propensity to be, at the very least, sympathetic to the perspective and approach of Russia, and especially in the sense that Russia seems to be winning the war right now, and the news about Pokrovsk might really sort of play into this.
And this is opposed to Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, if he, within the Republican circles, is considered to be perhaps more favorable to Russia. Marco Rubio, at least, is taking more of a traditional stance. Is there some kind of tension or struggle between these two approaches?
Yes, I mean, I think what's been very remarkable, and I think it's a fundamental question about any settlement, is that this is not just about an immediate peace, but it's also about a durable peace. And that means fundamentally addressing issues around security guarantees. Marco Rubio, in some of the statements that we saw in Florida, was certainly more in line with those lines. Now, it's not uncommon to have bickering and disputes within administrations. It's also not unusual to have both formal mediators as well as more informal mediators. I mean, there are precedents. But we certainly have seen a lot of jockeying within the Trump administration as to whom exactly speaks on behalf of the president when it comes to these important negotiations. I think Witkoff and Kushner have the wind in their backs in the sense of because of what happened over Gaza. And we know that President Trump is very keen on making deals and on appearing to be the key peacemaker.
You mentioned security guarantees there. How can US negotiators put pressure on Russia on these points, such as security guarantees, but also the size of Ukraine's army and whether or not Ukraine can join NATO in the future?
I think that's going to be still, which makes me relatively pessimistic that we're going to see any breakthrough today, is that there are certain questions which are really sort of zero sum. Whether, for instance, Russia's preferred position for the moment is that Ukraine, that its access to NATO is permanently closed. That is obviously different from Ukraine, who wants to maintain that possibility open in the future, even if they don't know even if they know that won't happen anytime soon. There are other issues. I think the size of the Ukrainian army that could probably be negotiated, and the numbers that we saw were not necessarily far apart. And I think for Ukraine, the size of the military is important. But what they're most concerned about is that they can have support from the West 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, after the war ends, where the risk of Russia reconstituting and trying to attack again is certainly very real and credible.
Yeah, and not to mention the issue of territory, which on Monday Volodymyr Zelensky said was the most challenging aspect of these peace talks. Do you see there being any kind of breakthroughs on this? What would it take for either Russia to agree to relinquish Ukrainian territory it currently holds, or for Ukraine to surrender that territory?
I would say for the moment, I think that the challenge is that the facts on the ground, at least as Vladimir Putin sees them, are favorable to him. I think for the moment, he believes he has the upper hand on the battlefield and therefore is not in any real rush to reach a deal unless it's very favorable and it follows his more maximalist positions. So I think that's going to be difficult. And of course, for President Zelensky, the idea of willingly signing away territory would be sort of political suicide. So I really don't see much convergence on that very tricky issue. We've seen all of the declarations in the last 24 hours coming from the Kremlin such as also their claims about addressing the root causes of the conflict, which is really code word for pushing back NATO enlargement, again, doesn't really strike a tone that they're really in a hurry to negotiate. I think they view a political benefit, that these negotiations are divisive or are, create anxiety amongst the Western camp. So for Putin, there might be a benefit to be seen to be open, but not really serious about these negotiations.
And the US has been continuing to push to get a peace deal for Ukraine, despite Russia walking away a number of times. What is it? What's in it for the Americans? Because with Trump, a lot of things are often transactional.
Well, I think, for good or bad, I think certainly Donald Trump has followed his word in terms of his idea of being a peacemaker, or at least his idea of being committed to negotiating and trying to end conflicts. Now, whether he deserves credits or whether he or not, that's of course a political discussion. But in that sense, I think it certainly seems to be a genuine desire. The challenge again is what kind of peace? If you want peace immediately at all costs, I think the risk there is that you're really just buying yourself time for the next few years. The other element that is a bit more disturbing is some of the reporting we've seen from the Wall Street Journal and others, that the economic benefits of peace and that the United States would be interested once the war ends to basically tap into some of Russia's economic resources. That is certainly more distressing, because I think that shows a certain cynicism towards the idea of the conflict that would be a very bitter pill to swallow, whether in Kyiv or in many European capitals.
Well, after failing to secure a ceasefire in talks between Trump and Putin in Alaska earlier this year, the US imposed sanctions which targeted Russia's energy sector. What kind of tools might Washington use again if Moscow again doesn't appear serious about peace this time around?
Well, I think that the sanctions can be a tool, but I think you shouldn't overestimate the abilities of the sanctions to necessarily change Russia's behavior. I think that the difficulty is Russia has been subject to sanctions for so many years that they have developed a whole number of workaround tools. I think the shadow fleet that they use to be able to sell oil on the market above sort of the agreed upon price caps is one such example. I think you've got to put pressure on other major purchasers of Russian oil. I think there was talk about doing that over India, and of course, China would be a key. But the challenge there is that Trump is also trying, on the other hand, to lower the temperature of the commercial war. So I think that's one of the dilemmas here, that sanctions are a tool, but unless they're really strongly implemented, their effect is rather limited.
All right, Garret Martin, thank you very much for your analysis. That was Garret Martin, the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center.